Outlaws of Thunder Junction and the associated commander product are here to stay. And with that, of course, we want to talk about the best legends for cEDH and how they are going to impact the format. This video is going to try and go in through all the legends that even could have some niche applications, talk about those for a couple minutes, and then be like, all right, let's move on to the next one, all right? This video is also sponsored by Wizards of the Coast. Thank you so much for sponsoring this video, Wizards. If you are interested in learning more about Outlaws of Thunder Junction, getting some associated product, all of that good stuff, there is a link in the description down below, which you should all click on and go check it out. Remember, you're here on YouTube, hit that like button, subscribe button, comment, all that stuff too. All right, so we got Tiny Bones the Pickpocket here. This Death Touch little guy is probably not going to be helming any commander decks anytime soon for cEDH at the very least, but it can be there in the 99. This little dude is going to be coming in, going to be hitting people, taking whatever the best non-land permanent is in their graveyard, and then giving you the ability to cast that with any type of mana being able to be spent. I see this as probably a card that is going to be in very niche decks, right? Like I have a feeling some cEDH decks might try it. I don't think a ton of them will, but I think some will definitely. I think some of the early evasive style decks, right? Like I wouldn't be surprised if like a Yuriko deck tried playing this for a little bit. Some Tymna decks, like Mardu Tymna specifically, is one that popped out to me a decent amount. I think having Death Touch is obviously very strong, and Death Touch is a very strong evasive ability, and your opponents are really going to question whether they can afford for this to connect. And having Death Touch specifically, not just like a form of evasion or some high power, means that whatever transaction occurs with the game, it's gonna put a lot of pressure on your opponents. I don't think it's probably the most amazing card we have in this set, but it's tiny little guy and he's up first. This one is super interesting. So we have Taiwen Perfect Shot. Whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to a creature equal to that creature's toughness, draw a card, right? So the first ability, basically, if your opponent has something with 3 toughness, you lightning bolt it, boom, you get a cantrip, draw that card right away. Now, important, the mana value of this card, right? Boros, it is a 2/3, right? Really efficient body, very resilient to Bowmasters. So this commander can really sit on the field and sort of chill for a little bit, right? And then it has a tap ability, which is where the interesting stuff starts to come in. So for X and tap, if a source you control would deal non-combat damage to a permanent or player this turn, instead it deals that much damage plus X instead. This is where the interesting stuff comes in, right? Because suddenly, you know, if you have a way to generate infinite mana, which turns out you can actually do that in these colors pretty easily, right? So, you know, say you have your Auriok Salvagers Bomberman combo popping off, or you have a Dockside Loop with either Cloudstone Curio or Meticulous Excavation, stuff like that, making infinite mana, and then you have your normal damage dealers, right? Because this deck is going to be full of a lot of things that are like damage taxing your opponents out, like Magebane Lizard and Eidolon of Red or Eidolon the Great Revel, stuff like that. I feel like this is going to be like Boros's first like Pain Stacks deck, you know, Scythe Claw Raptor, I feel like is going to be like an auto include in this type of deck. So if you have that sort of setup going, you can then immediately be like, all right, cool, with the infinite mana that I've generated. Or if you have pingers, you know, things like Thermo Alchemist and stuff like that, right? Being able to be like, all right, cool, generate infinite mana, tap by commander, ping you all once. Oh, we'll add 1,000,000 to the damage that I just dealt to y'all. You're dead, right? So that ability to have this sort of combo finish on top of the fact that the card itself is also pretty interesting as far as like, once again, you're getting some cantrips off of your damage, stuff like that. There's definitely a number of combos that exist with this commander where you can basically give something indestructible and then create loops where you're dealing damage to it equal to its toughness infinitely, right? Chain of Plasma is a card in particular that you can do where you can basically loop through your entire deck and then set up an Underworld Breach line, which is pretty cool. There's a lot of really weird, unique stuff you can do with this commander, and it's definitely not the most competitive viable when you look at it right away, right? The things don't jump out to you like, oh, this is obviously a food chain outlet, or oh, it obviously does this thing, right? But what it does do is a lot of really interesting stuff in a very atypical way. And I think the more you spend time with this commander, the more interesting things appear from it. And the fact that it only costs 2 is one of the things that makes it the most viable, right? Because very easy to get it out, very easy to recast it if it dies. I think this commander is going to be a bit of a sleeper from this set, and it's going to take Boros in a very weird, unique direction. I don't think a lot of people are going to know how to brew this at first, and I think it's going to be a while before we really get those numbers right. Geralf the Fleshbright, we have a 2/3 for 2 and a blue. Whenever you cast a spell during a turn other than your first spell that turn, create a 2/2 blue-black zombie rogue. Whenever a zombie ETBs under your control, put a 1/1 counter on it for each other zombie that entered the battlefield under your control this turn. This is Zombie Storm, the deck. It's really cool. Literally, you can play your commander, and then the second spell and onward the turn after you just play your commander gets you a 2/2, and then a 3/3, and then a 4/4, and then a 5/5, and then it gets out of control really fast, right? You can use things like Phyrexian or Ashnod's Altar to be generating you a bunch of mana by sacrificing the zombies that you're making right away. You know, not to mention any other sort of zombie synergies you can get in mono blue, but like, this is zombie high tide, right? Even if you do like not a real storm turn, right? I'm gonna cast 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spells because I snapped something and played a cantrip and pondered, and then I played a piece of fast mana, and then I did like blah, 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 whatever, right? You make a 2/2, a 3/3, a 4/4, a 5/5, and a 6/6, right? And that's enough to start beating people down, right? This is a really interesting commander. You get access to blue, all of its tools, right? You get access to One Ring and Minamo and Rhystic Study and Mystic Remore and all the good stuff we're used to, plus a bunch of different high tide synergies because you're in mono blue, right? You can do mono blue storm just like it's 2016 all over again. And then once again, you get all these weird kind of like, I can put all these sacrifice outlets in the deck that also generate me value so that I'm sacking these zombies, getting some value, using that to basically super zombie storm off. I think this is a really weird, cool deck, and I'm kind of excited to see what comes out of this commander because I think it's going to be one that people aren't really expecting. I think it's going to be doing some really weird stuff, and this is another one that I think, you know, it's not like I can be like, okay, plays generic combo. I can say, yeah, it's a high tide deck, right? Or I can say, yeah, it's an Isochron Scepter deck, because it also does work with Isochron Scepter Dramatic Reversal. You make infinite escalating power zombies, right? So, you know, make him 2/2 and then a 3/3, 4/4, 5/5, 6, all the way up. And then you can make that and just be like, and I pass the turn, right? Or, and this is something I talk about with Callahan on the Mind Sculptors, you can check out that video later. You can also just play an extra turn effect or play Born Upon the Wind to do this stuff at instant speed, right? So you're not only just like popping off, but you're doing it either in a way where you can go, cool, that was your end step, untap. Can I win on my turn? Or you can do it in a way where you go, do a bunch of stuff, do a bunch of stuff, do a bunch of stuff, last spell on my storm turn, time warp, take an extra turn. Well, now all these zombies are here and they got haste and they gotta go somewhere. And the answer is the red zone, right? So this is gonna be a really cool, weird mono blue deck. I'm actually really excited to see what comes out of this deck. You know, is the sacrifice stuff gonna be the thing propelling it the most? Is the extra turn stuff gonna be propelling it the most? What's gonna be like, is this even gonna be making a dent in cEDH? I don't know, but I think this commander has a lot of potential and is a really efficiently statted body, right? You can cast this off a Jeweled Lotus and then like play a cantrip, and that's immediately 4 power or 5 toughness on the board, just the first turn you play it, right? So like there's only so bad this can be on a certain level, which is really cool. And also, even if you're in like a counterspell fight with your opponents, right? And you're like, okay, cool, Flusterstorm your thing, and then I'll Mental Misstep the next spell you put on the stack. It's like, cool, that's a zombie. Incidental zombie. So yeah, I think this commander is really, really sick, and I'm excited to see what comes of it for sure. Kaervek the Punisher. This guy's a weirdie. So whenever you commit a crime, exile up to 1 target black card from your graveyard and copy it. You may cast the copy. If you do, you lose 2 life. I don't think this guy is gonna be running a deck in cEDH, and if he is, it's gonna be a weird deck that I have no idea how to build right now. But what I do think is that this card's pretty cool, right? Obviously, well, even if you do play on the commander, Entomb and Buried Alive and Unmarked Grave become very, very interesting, right? Because you can just start casting things out of your graveyard, getting a bunch of value with this card. The problem is to make this card work, you have to commit a crime, right? And not that committing a crime is always the hardest thing to do, right? There's like really weird cards where you can like pay 1 to like exile a card from your opponent's graveyard, and that's enough to commit a crime. But, you know, the problem I'm seeing with this card, and this is why I think it's more of a 99, because if you're playing a commander that likes this card, it has to be a low color deck too, because you only get black cards back out of your graveyard with this ability. But if you're in a deck that's like able to commit crimes very easily without really taking a lot of investment, then Kaervek becomes a lot more attractive, right? But you really have to hope that you are playing a low color deck that's very black heavy, and that can sort of incidentally cast crimes, or commit crimes, pardon me. And that's kind of a lot to ask from this card. It's a little limited, but I think it has potential, and I'm curious to see if anybody sort of pops off with it. We have Kumbal, Profiteering Mayor here. It is 1 in Orzhov for a 2/4. Whenever 1 more tokens enter the battlefield under your opponent's controls, for each of them, create a tapped version of that token. This ability triggers once per turn, and whenever 1 or more tokens enter the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1, you gain 1. I don't know how this card is good, but I think it's pretty okay, right? The idea is like, if you're playing against docksides and stuff like that, I don't think this is a commander. I think this is a card that you maybe put in the 99 of like a weird deck. The problem is I'm having a lot of trouble figuring out exactly where this guy goes, but obviously in situations where your opponents are like, cool, play a dockside, and then they make 5 treasures, and you're like, cool, I'll make 5 tap treasures, you have the turn cycle to kill me, I guess. I still don't know if that's good enough, but I think this card's pretty interesting. I at least wanted to mention it on this video. Stella Lee! I have an entire video on this commander. If you are interested in seeing that video, you should come check that video out, which I have linked up above. Another amazing video sponsored by Wizards of the Coast. While I'm talking about that reminder, just link in the description below if you want to find out more about OTJ product. If you want to pick up any of these commanders here, check out that link. But Stella Lee is a very powerful commander that I'm extremely excited about and I think is very strong, and you should go check that deck tech out if you want more details. This guy's a weirdie, but I think he's good enough. It's a cool, the Unrepentant Flying trample 5/5 for black, red, full double Rakdos casting cost, sack 3 creatures. You can put a creature from your hand onto the battlefield, activate as a sorcery and only once per turn. So there are a lot of restrictions on this guy, right? Like that end part, the fact that it's only as a sorcery, only once per turn, breaks my heart just a little bit, but sack 3 dudes, just drop whatever creature you want to drop on the field, drop a Hoarding Broodlord, drop a Razaketh, drop a Void Winnower, right? Like there are so many broken cards in red and black. I think this card can make it in cEDH. So like the ability to just be like, sack 3 cards, here's my Hoarding Broodlord. I'm gonna assemble the whole Hoarding Broodlord Saw in half combo by just sacking 3 dudes, right? Obviously, if you're playing this deck, you're doing it in a way where you have a bunch of fodder creatures in the early game. The math on this deck is gonna be everything, right? Like figuring out when, you know, what creatures make it, what things for sacrifice fodder, what things that make tokens work, right? You know, are you playing cards like Hordeling Outburst, right? That just make 3 tokens. So you're like, okay, cool, my commander's immediately online. I spent 1 card, got 3 bodies, and now suddenly that's a Void Winnower. That's all pretty strong, right? I think cards like Kuldotha Rebirth and whatever the new version of that spell that's name is escaping me are like perfect for this deck, right? Like you sack a Lotus Petal and you're like, cool, here's my 3 zombie or my 3 goblins, and sack all 3 of those, and suddenly that's whatever big creature I have in my hand at the current moment. Now, obviously the commander doesn't really help us in the sense of like, it's not an outlet that does anything, right? It doesn't like sort of infinite mana flicker or any of that stuff, right? But with the ability to cheat in the most powerful creatures in Rakdos, I feel like that's not really necessary. I think there is definitely going to be a way to make this card worth it, absolutely. And I'm really excited to build it because I don't think we've ever really seen an effect like this. There's not really another sneak attack commander in more than 1 color, like apart from like 5 mana Perforos that also costs mana to sneak attack. So I'm kind of into this commander. I think it's really cool. I'm definitely gonna be messing around with it. I think this is another one, like I've said with a couple of these cards, that it's like, it's not easy to just like copy and paste a shell to make it work, right? This one is gonna take work, it's gonna take effort, it's gonna take a certain balance of like, you wanna play these creatures to then do this thing, to then make it trigger, because then you have a Razaketh line, then you do this thing, right? Like it's not gonna be easy at all, but that's okay. I think it's gonna be really cool and super duper worth the payoff if you can make it work. Because I mean, the design of this card is absolutely sick, and I really, really hope I can see it in a cEDH game. I think, you know, we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens next, but I am more than excited to hopefully see this card across from me or in my own command zone. Look, it's not the best deck in the set. It's not even close to the most powerful, but they made Bruce Tarl his own commander, and I had to talk about it because he is technically cEDH viable. This is the Boros beatdown king, Bruce Tarl himself, this time as a roving rancher. So when he comes in, when he enters the battlefield or he attacks, which I really like, he has Titan text, right? Which is super sick. You exile top card of your library. If it's a land, you make a 2/2. His static also gives those 2/2 Oxen double strike. All about that. You can also play, you know, weird changelings in this deck and also give them double strike, right? You can have like a Taurian Mauler in this deck, or you can have Mirror Entity in this deck as well, right? So like, it's a lot of like quirky little Oxen you can sneak in here that aren't like super powerful, right? But you know, if you don't flip over a land, you can then cast that card until the end of turn, right? So if you have a way to make infinite combats or make infinite enter the battlefields of your commander happen, turns out you can just exile the entirety of your deck, make Oxen equal to the number of lands, and then hopefully be able to find some sort of win condition that way. So that means that this commander is an infinite dockside enabler, right? So if you're doing Cloudstone Curio stuff, if you're doing Meticulous Excavation stuff, Bruce Tarl is your guy. He's able to be, you're able to flicker your entire deck with this commander. I think it's also really cool because the fair plan of this deck is not bad at all, right? Like if you're just going to Ox Beatdown, if you're going to combat, attacking with Bruce Tarl, getting some card advantage, and then continuing to press your advantage over and over again, maybe doing a little bit of a stacks plan, but more in like the tempo sense until you can find your combo piece. I think this is really cool. I love that Bruce Tarl is a thing. It's pretty sick. I'm excited to see if anybody kind of messes around with this commander. I think it's, you know, at best, it's probably gonna be like a solid top 16 deck. You know, I could see it sneaking into a top 4 every now and again, but it's definitely a fringe deck for the format, but it's a fun fringe deck, and I'm glad that it exists because Bruce Tarl is like one of those iconic Magic characters, and I'll definitely probably sleeve this up at some point just for fun. But it's a cEDH viable big Ox guy, which is, you know, there's only so much you can ask for. Here we have the newest iteration of my least favorite commander. We have Svala Eager Trailblazer. It's a Vigilance 4/5, so pretty big body. Whenever you cast a creature spell, make a 1/1 mercenary with tap, target creature you control gets 1/0 until the end of turn, activate only as a sorcery. So already we're looking at this card. We'll go to the next ability afterwards, but it is the sort of like infinite cast outlet, right? So if you have a way to cast infinite amount of spells, all that stuff just makes infinite bodies, right? I don't think that's really the focus of our deck. The other part is you can tap to choose a color, add 1 mana of that color for each different power among creatures you control. So this is where the interesting part of this card comes in, because then it starts to kind of look like old Svala in the sense that you can tap it and make a bunch of mana from it. So if you have something like Sword of the Perins or Staff of Domination and a certain amount of creatures on the battlefield that have different powers, suddenly your commander is able to go tap for a lot of mana, untap for a lot of mana, tap for a lot of mana, untap for less than a lot of mana, right? Make infinite mana that way. So it's kind of got that outlet in the command zone. I think there's a lot of stuff that needs to go right for this commander, but the fact that it makes these mercenaries that then allow you to have the ability to change the power of the things you're doing kind of means that you can like stumble into the combo potential with this card without even really applying a ton of effort into it. So I'm kind of really about that. I think, you know, green-white is in a really bad place in cEDH in general. It's really hard to like make anything happen with these colors. That being said, you still get access to things like Grand Abolishers and Ranger Captains. I mean, don't even get me started. Like Ranger Captain can easily be like, you could even play like an Ornithopter in this deck if it really contented your heart to do so, right? Because then you could be like, Ranger Captain, go grab Ornithopter. Now I have 2 different powers on the battlefield. Sack my Ranger Captain, combo off of Svala. You know what I mean? There's a bunch of different stuff you can do with it. I'm not saying it's the most broken commander in the entire world, but I could see it seeing play in cEDH, and I'd be curious to see if this affects any of the old Svala pilots, if it just becomes its own thing. Yeah, I'm really curious to see what happens with this commander. I think it's, at the very minimum, an interesting commander that could have potential. I also think like worth mentioning when you're looking at the stuff to do with this deck, the card Earthcraft is very good with Savala's abilities because every creature you play then basically nets you 2 mana because you get a mercenary with Savala's ability that you can tap to untap a basic, and then the creature that you cast that triggers Svala also nets you something to be able to pump into Earthcraft. So I'm like, okay, this is like, there's some stuff here. I don't quite know what that stuff is, but this commander does stuff. It does broken stuff, and I think eventually you put enough broken stuff together and it's like, oh, okay, I kind of get what's going on here. Maybe it's a cEDH deck. This is another one that I'm like, there's a lot of you know, stuff floating around this soup. Someone's gonna make something nice out of it, you know. We got another face commander for one of these pre-con decks. We got Ganty, Cany Inquisitor. Spells you cast but do not own cost 1 less to cast. Whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, look at the top card of that player's library, exile it face down. You may play that card for as long as it remains exiled, and mana of any type can be spent to cast that spell. Super fascinating card. I think this card is actually pretty good. It's like Steely Timna, I believe is the joke I said on the Mind Sculptors for this card. It's really interesting. It has this like very powerful thieving ability where you take from your opponent's stuff. It makes cards like Praetor's Grasp and Mnemonic Betrayal and Opposition Agent better than they already are, which is saying something because they're pretty good cards. You can kind of lean towards this like Edric thing where you're like stealing from your opponents, and then if you get any extra turns or anything like that, that gives you more opportunity to take more stuff. It's a little awkward because you're not drawing your own cards, so therefore it's a little less likely to like actually be able to pop off with it. I think this commander is interesting though. I think it could see cEDH play. I'm still not sure just because of the Sultai rate to it. I will expect to see it at a cEDH table at some point. It depends on how efficient we can make this like spells that you cast cost less ability. Because if that triggers a decent amount, I think this card is better than it might look. Because otherwise it's like, you could definitely compare it to like Tymna Thrasios and wonder why it's not that combination of things, right? So very fascinated to see if this commander does make it. I was debating whether I put this guy on, but honestly, after seeing what Steve Stillman did with this on the Scrybabies episode that I played with him on, I kind of think this commander could make it in cEDH. The idea with Felix is that you're gonna basically load up the deck and basically make it Sultai Edric, which, you know, I'm not opposed to, right? But you put every sort of card that says like whenever a creature you control hits a player, draw a card. So Coastal Piracy and Bident of Thassa and Edric's by Master of Crest and the new Ganty, that's the face commander for this deck. And you put all those things in there. You put a bunch of evasive creatures in there, kind of like a Yuriko deck, right? Kind of like an Edric deck, but once again, you're in Sultai, which like super duper does not suck, right? And then you just like chunk your opponents for a bunch of damage, get a bunch of triggers off of it, and it's like, okay, this is kind of something. I'm not sure if this is gonna be good enough to make it in cEDH, but like the proposition of a Sultai Edric kind of intrigued me. I kind of got behind it, and I was like, all right, there's enough combat damage triggers in Sultai that I was like, originally not super sold on it. Now kind of being able to be like, all right, well, you can take a bunch of turns if you like loop that stuff, hit people, draw a bunch of cards, loop a bunch of turns, and then like you also just get the Oracle Consult. And it's like, at what point is that bad? You know, I'm not saying it's going to be the most efficient, most powerful cEDH deck out there, but I was humming and hawing on putting this one on there for a long time. But as I said, I got kind of convinced by seeing his performance, even just played as a normal casual deck. So I was like, yeah, I'm kind of about it. Maybe it'll just be a high power deck, but maybe the 5 boots can walk on into cEDH. We have Rakdos the Muscle. Big shout out to Cobblepot for doing a lot of work on this one, a name probably some of y'all haven't heard in a hot minute. One of the original cEDH brewer folk. Rakdos the Muscle is super interesting. It's a flying trample 6/5 for 2 black, red. Whenever you sack another creature, exile cards equal to its mana value from the top of target player's library. Target players, that part's kind of interesting, right? Until your next end step, so you get a full turn. You may play those cards, and mana of any type can be spent to cast those. So if mana fix is 2, you can tap your mana vault to cast a triple white spell. Doesn't matter. Then it has a second ability. It says sack another dude. Rakdos gains indestructible. Tap it. Activate only once per turn. Okay, so it's got a little bit of protection built in. Got like a bad sack outlet protected in. But what's cool about this commander and what really sold me on this commander is the use of cards with evoke, right? So things like Grief and Fury, kind of modern terrorist all-stars, right? That have been dominating the format, suddenly become like, if you exile a card to Fury, right? So say you have Ragavan and a Fury in your hand, you're like, cool, exile this Ragavan, evoke my Fury. I'm gonna deal 4 damage to whatever opponent's stuff I have, great. It gets sacrificed to its own ability. Suddenly Rakdos says, okay, cool. Choose a player, get 5 cards off of their deck. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute. Like suddenly this kind of bad evoke creature that I spent 0 mana to cast just gave me 5 cards, and now I still haven't spent any mana, and I've been able to get these 5 cards for free. That's pretty cool to me. I'm kind of into that, right? The idea that like I can cast an Ingot Chewer for 1 red mana, and I can evoke it out, blow up someone's artifact, it sacrifices itself, Rakdos says, cool, 5 cards, thank you very much. And the cool part about this card that I like, that I think like kind of gets missed with it, is like the once per turn part is stapled to its own sacrifice ability, right? So it's saying it itself can only cause a sacrifice once, but if you just sacrifice a bunch of stuff on your board, it super does not matter how many times you've done it, it can just keep ripping cards off there, right? So I can easily see you just like chaining evoke creatures into themselves, right? Shriekmaw and Ingot Chewer and Fury and Grief, and then just ripping card after card after card and having like an insane terminal velocity of cards from this Rakdos deck. So I have a feeling it's gonna be one of those commanders that like, if you let it untap, some dumb stuff is gonna happen. I think you could even play like Dargo in the 99, right? Like it's gonna be really, really cool. I'm actually very much excited about this card. I think it's gonna produce a lot of value. Now that I even said it, the Dargo in the 99 thing, I think is actually kind of insane because you can be like, cool, let me sack 2 creatures to cast Dargo super cheap. And then that's going to trigger Rakdos, flip a bunch of cards, and then use Rakdos' own ability to sack Dargo. That gives me 7 more cards. And once again, the fact that it can target players and not just yourself means that like, oh, you know, we need to be able to counterspell something, right? Here, let me sacrifice this 5 mana value creature. Look at the top 5 cards of the control player's library. Cool, now I have this Rakdos counterspell that I can cast, right? Like there's so many cool applications that this card has. The sacrifices are not sorcery speed restricted either, right? So say you have a big creature on your board, your opponent goes, all right, cool, I'm gonna Imperial Seal, and then I'm gonna hit you with Timna, go to draw my card. You can be like, cool, sacrifice my own dude, exile the top card of your library, take the thing you just tutored for, right? And you can do that, once again, add instant speed. This card is really, really exciting. I'm definitely super excited to see if anyone messes around with this deck. I think there are going to be folks playing it. The biggest downside is going to be Rakdos is a hardy investment of 5 mana, 2 of that being black, 1 of it being red. You have to invest a lot into it, and then it sits there on the table for that first turn and you play it. Like I would assume a large majority of the time, it is just going to wait there for you to be able to pop off, which is sick when you get to untap with it. I have a feeling the big choke point in that deck is going to be that turn that you invest in Rakdos and pass the turn, right? And so that's going to be the thing for the Rakdos players to figure out is like how to best utilize that card in its most broken form, right? But yeah, super excited about this one. I'm very excited to see what it does in cEDH. We have Catkin in here. This is Roxanne Starfall Savant, a Gruul 4/3 when it enters the battlefield or attacks. So another Titan style effect, which I really like that they're doing with a lot of these commanders. You make a tapped Meteorite. A Meteorite says it can tap from 1 mana of any color and it doesn't damage 2 damage to any target when it enters the battlefield. Whenever you tap an artifact for mana, add 1 mana of any type that artifact token produced. So when you tap a treasure to crack it, it produces another mana. When you tap the Meteorite token that your commander makes, it makes another mana, right? Anytime you are having a token that makes mana and taps to do so, it just adds another mana, just like Kinnan does, right? So benefits of this one versus a deck like Kinnan, right, is that it has repeated removal on it, right? That's kind of one of the things that makes this commander interesting. I think if it didn't have that, it would kind of not really be playable, but 2 damage repeatedly on your turn when it comes in, and when it goes to combat allows you to destroy other Kinnans, other opposition agents, stuff like that. It's also a food chain outlet, right? So if you infinitely cast your commander out of the command zone, you can infinitely make meteorites and deal 2 damage to people as you go through that process. You can also do the Teamer Sabertooth or Cloudstone Curio plus Dockside Extortionist combos. And if your commander's out during that process, it doubles the amount of treasure mana that you get from that process, meaning that those combos are cheaper than ever. You can execute a Teamer Sabertooth Dockside combo for only 3 treasures, which is pretty good. If you have a mana dork and you have Dockside, you literally only need to make 2 treasures to be able to combo off. That's pretty sick. I think this commander is really cool. I'm curious to hear folks are actually interested in this one. I think it's going to make some really cool decks. I think that, you know, the question is for a lot of these commanders, are these going to be seeing play? Who's going to be interested in them? And also if there's any things that I'm missing in this video that y'all are interested in, definitely want to hear about that for sure. Last on my list is probably the weirdest one I got on here. This is the Gitrog Ravenous Ride. Now there are going to be people who see this and wonder if I'm okay mentally, and that's fine. That's fine. I think this commander is really weird and interesting, and also has a bunch of really cool synergies. So let's talk about it. So for 5 mana, it has Saddle 1. It's a trample haster, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you can sack a creature that saddled it this turn. And if you do, you draw X and then put X land cards from your hand on the battlefield tap, where X is its power, right? So, you know, there's something to be said about potentially running some Amulet of Vigor stuff so that those lands come in untapped, so that when you do some broken stuff like I'm going to be talking about next, it's like, oh, okay, but this is also acceleration at the same time, kind of like a Summer Bloom style thing. But the idea is, hopefully with this deck, that you would be able to go to combat, saddle with something like, oh, I don't know, a Phyrexian Soul Gorger or Multani and Yargle, right? That was the first card that made me think of this deck as potentially viable, was the Multani and Yargle. Hunted Horror is another one for 2 black mana. It's a 7/7. I don't care if I give my opponents 2/3/3s. If I'm hitting my opponents, drawing 7 cards and able to put any number of lands in, 7 lands specifically, pretty good to me. So this is kind of like, you know, a weird, here's this card with a bunch of power and a really quirky downside style deck that turns into a very high velocity, maybe ad nause style weird deck that I'm all about, right? Like, it's like a greater good in the command zone kind of. There are several points of failure with it, right? In the sense that, like, if your commander gets bounced, if your other creature gets removed, like, there are definitely times in which, you know, things can go wrong with this deck, but it's strong. Like, it is objectively a strong ability if you can rip a bunch of cards off of it, right? Like, Hunted Horror is the one that keeps coming to mind to me, because once again, double black to make a 7/7, I will happily give some player that I don't care about attacking 2 3/3s so that I can hit another player, sack my Hunted Horror, draw 7 cards, and put up to 7 lands in. Like, that's insane to me. Like, Lupine Prototype's a 2-mana 5/5. Like, there's a bunch of quirky bad cards that this could, you know, just invest into, throw away, and draw cards that are way more valuable than a bunch of these bad cards in your deck, right? So I'm actually really about the Gitrog Monster Ravenous Ride. I don't know if it's gonna get there. I don't know if it's actually gonna be worth it, but it's pretty cool, and we'll see. Yeah, that's my spiel with this one. There's a lot of cool commanders here in Outlaws of Thunder Junction and the associated commander product. I think there's going to be some interesting decks coming out of the set. You know, a lot of these are not going to be commanders that I'm like, oh my goodness, this is an instant cEDH staple. It's an Esper good stuff pile. It's a 4-colored value, Nas, whatever. That stuff's not this set. What this set is some of the most interesting dynamic brewing of commanders that I've seen in a really long time. I think they're all in a super unique design space. I'm like really about this set as far as cEDH brewing is concerned. I can imagine a world where, I mean, especially Stella's one that I'm gonna see in a top 16 soon. I'm not even, like, if that's even a question, then I'm completely wrong, right? But like, that's a card I'm gonna see soon. Rakdos, the muscle, I think is insane. We're gonna see that soon. The rest of the stuff definitely has some potential here, but those two in particular, I'm like, there's 100% gonna be a showing of these guys. Roxanne definitely can see showing up. And a lot of the other stuff has potential, and I really could see some of these commanders. Once again, some of them take a little more work because they are not typical decks. You cannot just build them in the same way that a bunch of other decks are built, right? So they're gonna take effort, they're gonna take work, but they're gonna be playable, and they're gonna be hopefully pretty strong. So I'm really excited to see what comes out of these commanders. Thank you all for watching this video. Remember, this episode is sponsored by Wizards of the Coast. If you want to learn more about Outlaws of Thunder Junction, including where to pick up some of these sick legendary creatures, check the description in the show down below. Thank you all for watching. I'll catch you next time. Peace.